How Victorians grew the wheat that fed an empire 4 o'clock on an August morning in the year 1851. Somewhere in the chalk country of Wiltshire, a man is already awake. His wife pushes a hunk of bread and cheese into his pocket, the only food he will eat until noon. The dew is still heavy on the wheat. He picks up his scythe, runs the wet stone along its edge until the iron sings, and walks out into a field that stretches further than the eye can see. By sundown, that single man, with that single curved blade, will have laid an acre of standing corn flat upon the earth. He will do it again tomorrow, and the day after. For 3 weeks he will not sleep more than 5 hours in any night, and his back will not straighten until the harvest is in. This is how an empire was fed. For the next quarter of an hour, you are going to step into a vanished Britain, a country of golden fields and aching backs, of horse-drawn ploughs and steam-driven threshers, of harvest-home suppers and gangs of barefoot children stumbling through the stubble. You will meet the men who grew the wheat that fed 30 million mouths at home and shipped the surplus to every corner of the world. You will learn their wages, their tools, their songs, and the rituals they performed before a single seed went into the ground. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten lives, do consider subscribing to The Forgotten Harvest, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are listening from. We love to know. To understand Victorian wheat, you must first understand the land. Britain in the middle of the 19th century was a patchwork stitched together by hedgerows and stone walls, a landscape carved up by the Enclosure Acts of the previous century, when common ground was taken from villagers and handed to landlords. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, 3/4 of the land in England was owned by perhaps 7,000 families. Below them stood the tenant farmers, men who paid rent of perhaps 30 shillings an acre and lived in solid brick farmhouses with parlours they rarely entered. And below the tenant farmer stood the men who actually grew the wheat, the horsemen, the shepherds, the day labourers, the women who weeded the rows, and the children who scared the rooks. The English wheat belt ran in a great curve from the East Anglian fens through Lincolnshire and the Yorkshire wolds, down through the chalk of Wiltshire and Hampshire, and into the rich red loams of Herefordshire. In Norfolk, on the famous 4-course rotation, a farmer would plant wheat one year, turnips the next, then barley, then clover, a system perfected on the Holcombe estate by Thomas Coke and copied across the empire. A Norfolk farmhouse before dawn was a place of low murmurs and lamplight. The horseman rose first, before even the master, to give his pair of Suffolk punches their feed of chaff and split beans. He spoke to them in a voice no one else heard, by a tradition older than any book. The work itself was older than the Romans. In spring, the ploughman walked behind 2 heavy horses, 12 miles a day at a slow, steady pace, his eyes fixed on a furrow that had to be straight as a ruled line. For any horseman whose furrows wandered was a horseman shamed. In autumn, the seed was broadcast by hand from a hopper slung at the chest, the sower walking with a curious rolling rhythm so that each handful fell evenly on the soil. By harvest, in late July or early August, the wheat stood waist-high and golden, and the whole village turned out to bring it in. For most of the Victorian era, the cutting was done by men with scythes, long curved blades fixed to crooked wooden snaths, fitted with a frame of willow rods called a cradle that laid the cut stalks neatly to one side. A skilled mower could cut an acre a day. Behind him came the women, gathering the stalks into sheaves and binding them with twists of straw. Behind the women came the children, gleaning every fallen ear. For in many parishes, the right to glean was the difference between a winter eaten and a winter gone hungry. The wages were brutal. A grown man in the southern counties might earn 9 or 10 shillings a week, perhaps 12 if he was a skilled horseman with a cottage thrown in. A woman at harvest earned 6pence a day, sometimes 8pence. A child of 8 or 9, employed in one of the agricultural gangs that worked the great fields of the Fens and Lincolnshire, might bring home threepence after walking 5 or 6 miles to the field at dawn. These gangs, run by gangmasters who took their cut, were so notorious for cruelty that Parliament passed the Agricultural Gangs Act in 1867, forbidding the employment of children under the age of 8 and requiring gangs to be licensed by the magistrates. It was the first piece of legislation that admitted plainly that the wheat which fed the nation was being harvested by hands too small to grip a flail. After the cutting came the threshing. For centuries this had been the winter work, men in the barn beating the sheaves with wooden flails, the rhythm so distinct that village boys learned it before they could write. But in the 1830s, threshing machines began to replace the flail. Throughout the winter of 1830 and the spring of 1831, a wave of unrest swept the southern counties. Barns burned, machines were smashed. Anonymous letters signed by a man called Captain Swing arrived on the desks of magistrates. Captain Swing was not real. He was every labourer who had watched his winter wages vanish into a rattling iron drum. 19 men were hanged for the Swing riots. 480 were transported to Australia. The machines came anyway. By the 1850s, agriculture had become a great theatre of machines. Patrick Bell of Forfarshire had built a reaping machine as early as 1828, but it was the American Cyrus McCormick whose reaper dazzled the crowds at the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851. Suddenly an acre of wheat could be cut by a single man and a single horse in less than an hour. At High House Farm in Tiptree, Essex, a man called Joseph Mecchi, who had made his fortune selling razor strops in London, was running what he called a model farm, drained by clay pipes, manured by liquid sewage piped from his own house, and reported on in the agricultural press from Edinburgh to Adelaide. Mecchi was ridiculed at first. He died nearly bankrupt. But the methods he championed travelled with British emigrants to Canada, to Victoria, to the Punjab, to the wheatlands of South Australia, where they would one day grow the grain that came back on steamships to undercut the very farmers who had taught the world to farm. For now, though, in the high Victorian noon, Britain was the workshop of the world, and her wheat fields fed it. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 had opened the ports to foreign grain, and bread became cheaper for the workers in Manchester and Birmingham. Yet the British harvest still mattered enormously. In a good year, the country grew more than 2/3 of the wheat she ate. The quartern loaf, the 4-pound loaf that was the daily bread of a working family, fell from 11 pence to about 6 pence over the course of the Queen's long reign. That fall was paid for in the sweat of the labourer and eventually in his ruin. If this story is moving you, do pause for one moment to share it with someone who loves history. The Forgotten Harvest exists only because listeners like you keep these voices alive. A subscription, a like, a comment, each one is a candle held up in a dim room. And there were rituals. There were always rituals. The first sheaf cut at harvest was treated with a reverence no church service could match. In some Yorkshire villages it was kept whole and set in a place of honour at the harvest supper. In Herefordshire and Shropshire, the last sheaf was bound into the figure of a woman, the corn maiden or the kern baby, or in some places simply the mare, and carried home on the final wagon while the labourers shouted the harvest cry, a bellow so loud it was said to wake the dead at the next parish. Then came the harvest home, the long trestle tables in the barn, beef and plum pudding, strong ale brewed especially for the day, called harvest beer or hawky ale, and drunk from a wooden bowl passed hand to hand. The farmer himself served the first cup. The labourers sang songs that had no author and no date, songs about John Barleycorn who is killed and buried and rises again, songs about ploughboys and dairymaids, songs that connected the man cutting wheat in 1860 to the man who had cut it in the same field in 1460. Lammas Day, the 1st of August, was the festival of the loaf mass, when a loaf baked from the very first wheat of the harvest was carried into the parish church and broken upon the altar. By Victoria's reign, the festival was fading, kept alive only in the older villages, but the memory of it lingered in the way every farmer's wife held the first new loaf for a moment before she cut it. And there were corn dollies, small intricate figures plaited from the last hollow stems, hung in farmhouse kitchens through the winter, ploughed back into the earth in the spring to release the corn spirit and ensure the next harvest would not fail. They were not toys. They were prayers made of straw by hands that had no other words for what the harvest meant. By the end of the century, all of it was changing. From the 1870s onwards, wheat from the American prairies poured into British ports at prices no English farmer could match. Rents collapsed. Labourers drifted to the towns and the colonies. Whole parishes lost a third of their people. Joseph Arch, a Warwickshire hedger, founded the National Agricultural Labourers Union in 1872 and gave the silenced men a voice for the first time, but the tide was already running out. The harvest home suppers grew smaller. The corn dollies were swept into drawers and forgotten. The great barns where men had once threshed by flail were turned into garages, then into holiday cottages, and at last into nothing at all. But the next time you stand in an English field at the end of summer, when the wheat is ripe and the sun is low and the swallows are gathering for their long flight south, listen. Listen for the rasp of a whetstone on iron. Listen for the soft, steady shush of a scythe through standing corn. Listen for a child's voice calling out behind a hedge. They are still there, those men and women and children who fed an empire. They have only gone a little way ahead of us into the gold of the evening. If this story has moved you, please share it with someone who would love to walk in those fields with us. And tell us in the comments below which forgotten craft or tradition you would like to hear next. The shepherd's year, the village blacksmith, the women of the herring fleets. We are listening, and we are writing. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers of the harvest.